Good morning and happy Sabbath. We have been already ministered to, and there's more to come. I would like this to be interactive, so it's not a health talk just alone, it's a health interaction. So, first thing is this question right here. Which is the weaker sex? In your table, you have 15 seconds to come with an answer. Go ahead. Did I hear amen? Okay, he said the men. All right. Okay, we're going to be looking at how to enhance the female advantage, okay? Because women have an advantage. Now, when we talk about just basic strength, we need to know that men are basically stronger than women, physically, right? And we said somebody said some of them physically. Yeah. All right. But in general, men, because of their stature, because of their musculature, etc., are stronger physically by and large. Okay. But so why should we be talking about women's health if we say that men are supposed to be physically stronger? Well, the reason is because much of what has happened over the years is that people haven't paid attention to women and women's health. Okay? It's only recently that has been part of the medical structure for looking at things. Okay? Women represent a unique and essential half of the human population. So we should be very much interested in what happens with women because women are part of the fabric of society. As a matter of fact, no women, no more society, right? Okay. Well, no men, no more society too, but that's all right. Okay. Anyway, they can't be ignored any longer. That's the thing. Okay, so we now have, believe it or not, since the 1990s, an idea that we should be looking at gender and how gender affects a person's health and how different medications and different things affect women differently from they affect men. Now, I'm not going to get into any politics, but this has caused a huge problem recently because what do you do with a woman who becomes a man or a man who becomes a woman, right? Okay, so we have some issues there. All right. In most communities worldwide, okay, women represent the cornerstone of the family's health. Okay? You know the statement that some of you may remember, it goes like this: if mama isn't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? That's what it says, right? So we're going to see a little bit later how that plays out. We all have a mother. Now, on your table, there's a list: cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, none of the above. Which is the leading cause of death among women in the United States? On your table, okay? Let's hear what you guys are going to say. Come on. Yeah, around your table, talk to the people on your table. What do you think? So out of all of these, out of cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia, or none of them is the leading cause of death among women in the United States. Which one? Breast cancer? Cardiovascular? Okay, all who say cardiovascular, heart disease, raise your hand. Okay, all who say breast cancer, raise your hand. Okay, all who say none of those two. Okay, I think it's a trick question. Well, let me show you what the answer is. What does that look like? Yeah, that unfortunately is the most common. Statistics have been carried on in this country looking at cause of death since 1902. And since 1902, the leading cause of death among women is heart disease. Okay? Yeah. How about worldwide? This is United States. How about worldwide? What do you think? It's the same. All right, it's the same. Okay. And if you want to see kind of the relationship between death from heart disease versus death from other kinds of things, you see that little dot on the right-hand side? That's how many people die because of war. That little dot. And look at the size of that dot compared to the yellow dot on the left. Okay? So we can talk about the loss of life in war. We have wars that are going on right now, and we can talk about loss of life there. But how come we're not talking about these other things? Look at heart disease, circulatory disorders, cancer, respiratory disorders. Look at the size of those compared to the number of people who die in war. But war makes the news, right? Every day, people die of illnesses that can be largely prevented. We have to die of something, right? But many of the people who die of these illnesses today die prematurely. They didn't have to die. Okay, so here's a research study on what they found. What they found was that 1 in 2 women in the US dies of heart disease or stroke, many of them undiagnosed and untreated for the risk factors that they have. In other words, the doctors, the nurse practitioners, the physician assistants, all of these, we see these things, but the person doesn't get the diagnosis and therefore they don't get adequate treatment. Okay? Are women aware of heart disease being the #1 killer? They tried to find out in this study. How do women perceive their own risks? Do they realize the risk factors that they have for heart disease? And what do they know about their own risks? This study was looking at that, and what they found is only 8% of women identified heart disease and stroke as their greatest health concerns. Only 8%. That means 92% thought it was something else. They have to be worried about something else. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other things that should concern us, right? Domestic violence, for instance, is a big problem. But heart disease is much, much bigger, right? Only 33% identified heart disease as a leading cause of death for women and even for men, okay? It's easy for people to think that heart disease is a cause of a leading cause of death for men, because this is what the news tends to promote. This is what the journals and the magazines tend to say. But the reality is, it's the leading cause of death for women as well as for men. Okay? So, between the ages of 22 and 44, these individuals perceived that breast cancer is the major threat to health. So, women between 25 and 44 in this study, they thought breast cancer, that's a thing, right? You know, the impact, the emotional impact of a woman dying from heart disease and a man dying from heart disease has a lot to do with where the peak of women dying from heart disease is and where the peak of men dying from heart disease is. Men tend to die of heart disease earlier in life, between 40 and 60 years of age. Typically, we say that's during the time that the man is very productive, he has a young family more or less, right? He's now getting into having a grandchild or something like that. And he might be, you know, at the peak of his employment, of his job or his career. And so when this happens, people say, wow, you know, he was so young and so vibrant, and this is definitely premature. Women, the peak tends to be in the 70s and 80s. Okay? So it's grandma. Even though grandma is a mom, it's grandma, or could be great grandma, right? And what do people say? Oh, she was so sweet. She lived a wonderful life. You know, the emotional impact is not as great because, you know, she's lived her life. But what if she could live until 100? right? It's still premature if it could have been prevented and was not, okay? The thing is, we're not well informed about these things, and women have suffered. But there's good news, okay? There has been, over the last decade or so, an astonishing increase in knowledge. We've understood more about what happens in women as opposed to what happens in men, and women's health is distinctly different from men's health. Regardless of what people are trying to tell you on the news about this indifferentiate, and you can't tell the sex, and you can't tell a boy when he's born. And I'm not getting into the politics. I'm just talking basic science. Okay. If we look at men versus women and the causes of death, the conditions that cause problems in men and women, we have a difference as well. The way men do it and the way women do it. In gonorrhea, men is 10 times higher than women. Okay? I wonder what happens with a transgender person. I don't know. We don't know. Okay? What that means. Okay? If we look at the aortic aneurysms, that's this ballooning of the really great artery that we have in our bodies, it's 1/5 the likelihood that a woman will have a problem compared to a man. Gout, 1/4 the risk for women versus men. For kidney stones, 1/3 the risk. For alcoholism, 1/3 the risk. Bladder cancer, 1/3 the risk. Emphysema, half of the risk. And duodenal ulcer, half of the risk. Okay? So, when we look at women's health in the United States, what we see over the last 30 years is that the life expectancy of women went from 78 to 81. By the way, since COVID, actually just before COVID, we were anticipating that there'd be a decrease in the life expectancy for everybody in the United States. And part of that has to do with the way we live, okay? So be aware of that. The percentage of American adults, however, who smoke has decreased from 28% to 16% in the last 30 years, right? There used to be a commercial on television I used to see as a child, "You've come a long way, baby," right? Well, I think women are now getting wiser and saying, I don't have to smoke that. I don't have to have those long, thin cigarettes to look, snazzy. I can do it without that, all right? The number of women who die from heart disease, the leading cause of death in women, has gone down from 1 in 3 women to 1 in 4 women. Isn't that something? Praise the Lord. You know what has caused that? Huh? Education. More interest, more education, more awareness. Okay, thank God. Okay, over 90% of breast cancers found in the early stages can be cured. So even though breast cancer, a serious and important medical problem, especially among women. By the way, men get breast cancer too. It's only about 1% of all breast cancers happen in men. So 90% found in the early stages, and the death rate has gone down nearly 2% per year in the last 10 years. So there's been some great advances with regard to even the problem with breast cancer in the United States. Okay? So, based on that, which is the weaker sex? Well, let's see. Do the organs that males and females have in common function the same way in both sexes? What do you think? Like we have hearts in common, we have brains in common, we have livers in common, right? We have intestines, we have all these in common. So do they function the same way in males and females? No? Well, there's a story of somebody was shopping for brains. Of course, it's a story, okay? It's a story. Somebody was shopping for brains and went to a store that sold brains, right? And, well, the first thing they did was they measured the size of the person, and they said, well, we have to find a brain that will fit you, okay? And so they looked at the brains that had the same size, and, well, there were some brains that were there that were going relatively cheap, a few $100. And then there was the male brains that were same size, were in the thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. Notwithstanding, they weren't in the billions, right? Thousands and tens of thousands. So the person said, well, why is it that the women's brains tend to be less expensive and the male brains tend to be more expensive. And the salesperson said, well, it's because these are used and those aren't. Some people are still trying to get it. Dr. Caesar, you're still trying to figure out what's going on. He's disagreeing. It's all right. As I said, it was a joke, all right? Do females and males relate to God in the same way? What do you think? No? So the spiritual experience for a man is different from the spiritual experience for a woman? Okay, all right, well, let's go and see. Okay, first, we need to understand, and now this is bordering on the political, but women are females. They're not some alteration of males. In their own right, they're females. Girls are not just feminine boys. Okay? Girls are girls and boys are boys. They're different, right? In size, body composition, stature, percent body fat, distribution of body fat, cycles, pregnancy, lactation, post-pregnancy, menopause, all of these things are different. Okay? As a matter of fact, if a woman gets prostate cancer, we have a problem. Women don't have prostates. Okay? So, the impetus to understand women's health has been stymied somewhat by what's going on with the gender issues in the country, but the federal government started to give funding for including women in clinical trials so that women will be represented, because women oftentimes have a different reaction, a different response to the same kind of therapy, but it was not known before. Everything was done in terms of the men who were the people in the studies, right? Hospital revenues is part of the driving force, because who goes to the doctor more often, the women or the men? Women. The women, okay? So that becomes an issue. Female patients have become more aware and more insistent and advocating for their own health, and also others, men, who are advocating for women's health, okay? And also, there's been a rise in women-friendly practitioners, okay? People who dedicate their medical practice to taking care of women and women's health issues, okay? Not just OBGYNs, okay? Even Harvard has produced now not just Harvard Health Watch, and not just Harvard Men's Health, which they had. Now they have Harvard Women's Health Watch, okay? That should tell us that people are saying, I want to pay attention to what's happening with women's health, okay? Now, unfortunately, there are some issues that have been discovered regarding how women see themselves versus how men would see themselves, okay? And social media and body image has produced some of this, this difference that we can see. Men tend not to compare themselves with other men on selfies and things like that. It's not common to see men taking a lot of selfies, right? But women, okay, so we're hearing that that's disputed in the front table as well. Yeah. Anyway, women tend to take more selfies, and girls tend to take more selfies, and the girls taking selfies, they compare themselves with other girls on the internet, okay? This has caused a significant problem in what is happening with young girls and their psyche as they compare themselves with others, and they don't even know that some of the others have these pictures that have been retouched and redone, okay? And they're looking at themselves against that, okay? So this has caused a significant mental health problem in this country, okay? If we look at life expectancy and the gap between life expectancy from males and females, you will see that gap has actually been increasing. We don't know what the results will be after COVID, but the gap has been increasing over the years. Okay. Now here's this statistic. Uh, over the course of a lifetime, the amount or the proportion of men and women in the society, in the community, changes. And that's because of the differential death rate of men versus women. So at age 65, there's 77 men for every 100 women. Okay? At age 85, there are only 38 men for every 100 women. Okay? So we have women at age 85 who, if all their friends were going to be just men or their husbands or so, then they'll be very lonely. And guess what? Many are. If it weren't for the fact that women tend to be more social than men. Okay, so men at age 85, if a man reaches the age 85, he tends to be more lonely than a woman at age 85. Okay? Among centenarians, that's people who reach 100, 25 men for every 100 women. So more women get to 100 than men. Among the previously married elderly, widows are more than 50% of all women over age 65. In other words, their husbands are gone, right? And widows outnumber widowers by at least 3 to 1. Okay? So, well, I guess if women were competing for a husband, it's better to compete when you're young than when you get old. Right? Because there are less men to go about. These demographic shifts, however, are not just in the United States. It's all over the world. We see the same thing, whether the country is industrialized or it's a developing country. And the issue starts really from conception to birth, the males versus females, how many are conceived. Women carrying girls have almost 20% greater maternal serum, human chorionic gonadotropin, than women carrying a boy fetus due to the genetic differences in male and female placentas. I wish somebody would broadcast this on the news so that people understand that males and females are different even from the time of conception and when the mother is carrying the baby. All right? Women in the second and third trimester of pregnancy, the female maternal, this is a marker, a hormone, that hormone is greater than women who are carrying a boy. Okay? So if we could measure this hormone, which we do, we can see whether the baby that you're carrying is boy or girl. So don't tell me when that when that baby is born, you can't tell whether it's a boy or girl. Right? You know nowadays that's what they're doing, right? Yeah. Okay. So how long does it take for there to be a differentiation between boy and girl in the mother's womb as a fetus? Less than 3 weeks. In other words, we can tell if the fetus is going to be male or female within 3 weeks of conception. Okay? We don't have to wait to see the anatomy. We can do it chemically, right? So how is it that when a baby is born today, and you can actually see the external features, that we're saying, don't say boy or girl until the child decides whether he is or she is a boy or girl. We're having some serious problems here, right? Okay. Some of the facts related to men and women: longevity, disease burden, and women live longer, more or less. Women have less disease burden than men, and the issue is, it's a process that occurs from womb all the way to term. Okay? Women are different from men. Females have advantages biologically, behaviorally, socially, and could it be that they have an advantage spiritually as well? Well, some of the biological factors, I'm not going to get into this, it's a little bit too much for the time that we have, but most of the biology of women and women's health demonstrate that women have biological factors that protect them from many of the problems that face us today in society that are lifestyle related. Okay? If we look at the brains, Dr. Caesar, if we look at the brains, the male brain versus the female brain, there are some developmental differences between male and female brains. By the way, during the course of the development of the child in utero, something happens, and the brain structures that connect one side to the other essentially get cut in half. Okay? Male brains have a greater separation one side from the other than female brains. Female brains have a lot of interconnectivity. And the thing that causes that to happen is the production of testosterone by the male child. Okay? So again, this is something that happens in utero before the child is born, and the brains are going to be different from, they were different before, but they're even going to be more different now because this is happening, right? So there are anatomical differences and there are functional differences. The way the brains function in males and females is different, regardless of what part of the world you come from, what race, caste, or whatever, right? If we even look at the bugs, the bacteria and so on that we have in our intestines, males carry different proportions of these bacteria than females. Okay? So we could, again, if we look at what's going on in the intestines, right, even the bacteria that are there tell us whether you're male or female. Right? Okay. Behavioral factors. We know that males are more prone to violence. That's it. Okay? So much so that, that the criminologists know mass murderers, serial killers, etc., they don't profile women. They always profile a man. It's not to mean that there aren't women who perpetrate these violent crimes, but it's most likely going to be a man, not a woman. Okay? Risk-taking, men take more risks than women in general. Tobacco use, alcohol, and substance abuse, greater among men than women. Women seem to have greater resilience when it comes to these kinds of factors. Let me go into the next one. If you look at behaviors such as how men eat versus how women eat, the amount of physical activity that men do versus women, these are different. Some of them are related to the culture that you come from, but the issue is men and women have different behavioral factors. Men eat differently from women. Okay? Health behavior. Who do you think seeks the doctor more? The male or the woman? The man or the woman? The woman does, all right? How do the guys get to see the doctor? Their wives tell them. Right, do you know who looks more at the internet to find out how to, you know, what their disease is, or what's happening with the kids, or what's happening? Who does? Men or women more? Women, okay? So women tend to be more educated in general about health issues, but interestingly enough, they're more narrow, and the narrow scope tends to be more related to the family and children, as opposed to necessarily their own health. Okay? Some of the social and relational factors include work stress, hostility, social networks, and the effect of marriage and divorce. Men are more affected by a divorce and by a marriage than women. Okay? Yes. Okay? A man who is divorced has a greater risk of dying of heart disease than a woman who's divorced. Okay? So when we come to spirituality, we have to understand that there's some spiritual metrics that we try to look for, right? Some of them have to do with how people are intrinsically, how they really relate to God intrinsically. Or how they relate to God because people have told them, so it's an extrinsic, something from outside that's causing them to do this, right? So someone who's going to church, they want to be going to church because everybody else is going to church and they have some pressure to go to church. Some people go to church because they want to be in church, right? So that's the intrinsic stuff, I want to do it, and the extrinsic stuff is that others are doing it and they might be pushing me, I'm getting a little bit of pressure, and therefore I do it, okay? Well, what we find is that women tend to have more intrinsic religiosity. Women tend to want more to relate to God than men do. Okay? We find even extrinsic religiosity, that is where others are doing it and they're encouraging somebody to do it. Women tend to have more extrinsic religiosity as well. That's why if you go to a church, any given church, on any Sabbath or any Sunday, right, you'll find more women in church than men. Okay? All right. So that affects things or other markers that we look at, such as church attendance. But you know, when you look at the research of church attendance, people who attend church regularly live longer. Did you know that? Yeah. Okay. People who tend to be more intrinsically religious actually live longer if you look at all-cause mortality, death from any cause, right? They tend to use substances less frequently, right? And they tend, if they get sick, to have less serious diseases, okay? So this is something that is an interesting thing. And it pertains to men and women, but the women being more involved in this, they tend to get a better response, okay? In terms of spiritual factors, we use, and much of the research looks at the Judeo-Christian context. And we see God as Father. God, our Heavenly Father. But when we really look at some of the attributes that we would ascribe to a mother, we actually see God is not just Father. God is Mother too, right? He has said even that a woman might abandon her children, but He will never abandon us. Okay. Now, the influence in a family of the man versus the woman actually has come under study. What is the influence of men and women in their family? If someone becomes a Christian, for instance, in the family, which one has a greater impact on the family, the man, the woman, or the child? Okay, so there are some gender differences that we mentioned in spirituality. If you see, the yellow is men and the purple is women. So if we look at people who are very religious, that's the far left, we would see that women are more very religious than men who call themselves very religious. If you look at fairly religious, we see that women are more likely to say that they're fairly religious than men who say that they're fairly religious. If we see not too religious, okay, we also see women more than men. And when we see not religious at all, the men talk to them. Okay? You know, when I was in clinical practice, I used to make rounds, and at this particular time I was working at the VA hospital in Loma Linda. I'd make rounds on Fridays, take off my white coat and go and talk to the patients. And of course, being a veterans hospital, at that time it was mainly men, okay, from World War II and from Vietnam, etc., Korean War. So I'd go and I'd talk, and I would ask people, I'd ask my patients, right, you know, how are you doing? And I'd get to talk about spiritual things. And whenever I brought up something that was spiritual or religious, the first thing that the men said, I mean 99% of the time, is they would turn the conversation to their wives. They'd say, my wife is. My wife. And I'd have to say, well, wait a minute. It's nice that your wife is. How about you? Oh, no, Doc, that's not for me. Many of them would say, that's not for me. Okay? Well, if we look at the difference between church attendance from males versus females, even though this is a dated slide, there is a decrease in the gap that we see over the years. The last data that we have from the Pew Research Group was in 2012. But there's some more recent study, especially looking at what has happened during the pandemic. And you know, the pandemic was a great equalizer. Many people started to see more religious things. But I want to posit and end with this idea. We have an enemy of souls. And he knows who he should direct his attack upon. Okay? Here we are, we're talking about women's health. But look at this statistic. This was done by the Promise Keepers and Focus on the Family. Did you know that if a child is the first person in a household to become a Christian, there's a 3.5% probability that everyone else in the household will become Christian? Wow. Right? Child, 3.5% chance. If the mother is the first to become a Christian, there's a 17% chance that the family will become Christian. But if the father is the first, there's a 93% probability that the So if you were the devil's advocate, if you were the devil, who would you attack? The men. So women, you have a job to do. Improve the health, not just of yourselves, but the health of the men in your lives too. God bless you.